Well, sure. Thank you for coming to church this morning. We're back in the book of James. We're going to look at temptation today. Temptation, who's to blame? And it'll be coming from James chapter 1, verses 13 to 18. And we all are tempted. Every man is tempted without a doubt. It happens in all of our lives. And it's true. We all are tempted. Everybody's tempted. It's not just the Ten Commandments per se. A lot of times, sometimes we're tempted to not exactly pay taxes or pay the full taxes. Sometimes we're tempted to shave a little time off our job or add a few minutes and we get paid. There's plenty of temptation out there for everyone, and we're all subject to it. And there's all sorts of subtle temptations that come into our life. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that the temptations are common to man. And one ancient writer said when we're saved, we need to remember that our baptism did not drown out the flesh. We face a battle of temptation constantly. We deal with it. It's a marvel of the genuineness of our faith that if we do face temptation, it's how we face it more than the temptation itself. And how we deal with it shows the genuineness of our faith and the lack of true saving faith if we don't handle it well. So we're going to see, and we see in chapter 1, verses 2 to 12, that talks about a test. And there's a world of difference between a test and a temptation. 2 to 12 talks about trials. And God will send trials, and we see that all the way through. This whole book is about tests. So all the way from 1 to 5, James presents to us tests and how God will test our faith. He'll test our faith individually. He'll test our faith as a couple. He'll test our faith as a family. He'll test our faith as a church. Because that was his pattern when he was on earth. That he would teach the disciples, and they would learn, and they'd all shake their bony heads up and down. Yeah, they got it. Well, the Lord would send them a little test that related to what he taught them, and most of the time, just like the rest of us, the disciples failed. So he will test us. He's not going to tempt us. Ding, ding, ding. God will not tempt us to sin. We get in that kind of trouble all by our little lonesome, and Satan will help us. God will test our faith. He'll never tempt our faith. So how we deal with temptation is a test of the genuineness of our faith. It's normal for the unsaved to not take any blame for their own sins. When they're tempted, they fall into sin, it's typical for them to put the blame somewhere else. I think of kids. No one is quicker to blame somebody else than a kid. It was my brother, it was my sister, it was Johnny, it was Susie. They've always got somebody to blame. Yeah, kids, we all know as grandparents, we know. We let them talk, but we really know who's really at the bottom of whatever it is they did they're trying to get out of. James is saying here is how you respond to temptation and where you put the blame if you're going to blame somebody else for your own mistake. And if you do, the genuineness of your faith is called into question. There's a quick change, really, verse 12. Blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he's tested, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. That's great. Verse 13 says, let no man say when he's tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. Neither tempteth any man. There's a shift there. So those are being tested to being tempted. And he's been teaching us about the trials the Lord allows to come into our life. And that makes us stronger when our faith is tested and we pass the test. That increases our faith, and that's great. In verse 12, blessed is the one who endures the trials. These trials are outward circumstances which test our faith. And when our faith is tested, that produces spiritual growth. But trials can turn into temptations. Every difficult thing that comes into my life either strengthens me because I obey God, and I can stay confident in His care and I trust, so I'll grow. So I grow or I'm tempted. A lot of times the test can turn into a temptation because we'll end up trying to doubt God. To doubt God. If the Lord sends something in our life to test our faith, and we get angry about it, we're going to turn around and we try to blame God for the circumstances. That's not passing the test. Sometimes we deny His word. That the Scripture says, thus saith the Lord, and it comes into our life and we deny His word. That's not smart either. Sometimes we'll just plain disobey God when we know to be the truth. We're going to dig our heels in and we're going to try to disobey the Lord and not do exactly what we know we should do. Or in plain English, we just plain give in to sin. Because that's our human nature in the flesh, is we're going to give into that sin. And every trial has the potential to turn south on us. It all depends on our response. Every circumstance of life that we face provides us with a decision. It's a decision whether we'll move ahead in faith in God by obedience to His word, or I'm going to listen to that voice that suggests an easy way out, and I'll take the easy way out, and usually it ends up falling into sin. And if I fall into sin, whose fault is it? Is it God's fault? It's not. When I fall into sin, you fall into sin, it's not God's fault that we fell into sin. It's our own cotton-picking fault because we were trying to take an easy way out or avoid the consequences or something. Is it the fault of circumstances? Is it the fault of my being created the way God created me? The way I am, I can't help it? No, that's not going to hold water either. Whose fault is it? God brings a trial, but if God brings a trial into my life to see if we've learned our lessons and if we're growing in our faith, and it goes south on us, whose fault is that? An example is found in Genesis 3. Great example. You've got Adam and Eve and the snake. You've got, perfect example. God says, Adam, where are you? Well, we're going to turn there. We're going to turn to Genesis 3. Genesis 3. God says, Adam, where are you? In verse 11. And He said, who told you that you're naked? So there's our first issue. They sinned and realized they were naked. After their sin, their eyes were open to the fact that they disobeyed God. So there's disobedience right there. So we have to understand they were in a place that was perfect. Every fruit was perfect. Every vegetable was perfect. And they didn't have to do a thing. They didn't have to fertilize nothing. They didn't have to do anything. They could just go out and get whatever it is they wanted to eat. It was perfect. But unfortunately, they fell into sin. And that changed the whole thing. So He said, Adam, where are you? And he said, I heard the voice in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. They didn't have a problem. There was no shame. No shame at all. So I realized, now that my eyes are open, I realized I was naked. And He said, who told you you were naked? So God's asking some deep questions here. Did you eat of that tree where I commanded thee that thou should not eat? Did you and Eve take a nibble off that tree? Of all this whole perfection you're living in, of all this absolute perfection, the one thing I said was don't touch that tree. And then they say, the apple, all that nonsense. We don't know what kind of tree it was. All God said, it could have been a pine tree. All God said was, don't touch it. Don't go near it. So here, He says, I want you to look at verse 12. And the man said, now, the woman you gave to me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. Adam in the beginning didn't know what a woman was. He's really not blaming Eve. So if you look at it, what you really see is the woman, what you gave me that woman. Whose fault was it? Oh, it had to be God's fault. So now Adam's saying to God, why did you create her? Because if you hadn't created her, I wouldn't be in this mess. You talk about blame shifting. Sending her, no. And the woman, and then in verse 12, and the man said, the woman you gave to me, yeah. The woman. That's it, the woman. No, the serpent beguiled him. That's what the woman, verse 13. And the Lord said unto the woman, what is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, here we go again. It's all my fault. I was tempted and I fell. No, it was that serpent. It was that snake. He beguiled me and I ate. So what do we got going on now? Oh yeah, blame shifting. Adam said it was that woman. The woman said it was the snake. I'm the victim here, Eve says. I'm the victim, just like my husband. We're victims. We're victims of something you created, God. I was just in the garden and doing my gardening, and all of a sudden a snake showed up. I didn't make that snake. I didn't make that snake talk. The blame's put on God. It's been that way ever since the Garden of Eden. God gave me my surroundings. God created this, and it's not my fault. That's in Genesis 3. How much has it changed to today? Nothing's ever anybody's fault. No one today wants to stand up and take responsibility for their actions. Nobody today wants to accept their actions for their sin, or the penalty for their sin. But they'll find out the penalty of sin is death, eternal death. In Isaiah 63:17, you hear, what a terrible thing to blame God for your sin. But that's the tendency of fallen flesh, to shirk responsibility for their behavior, and even go so far as to blame God for their sin. We're all tempted. We all sin, and frequently we blame God. And we're blaming God for our circumstances, and we blame our weakness. We know I'm only a man, or I'm only a woman. Or, I like chocolate and I'm not supposed to eat chocolate, but that's my weakness. No, that doesn't work. Blaming our propensities. Sometimes folks want to, that's just me and my propensity is to do this because when this happens, this is what I always do. Blame our surroundings. Well, what are you going to do? I was in a situation where you really get to blaming just about everything but yourself for the sin you have in your life. Because it hurts. When you have to accept responsibility for your action, you have to accept responsibility for your sin, and that hurts. Because you actually have to think. You actually have to ask God for forgiveness and mean it when you say it, so you can get a clean slate. We blame our friends. Well, it was that group I was with, or that was that group of girls, or the group of guys, and they were smoking dope or something. Well, you know how it is. Blame a relative. Well, my uncle was... Your sin is your sin. You fall into sin, you didn't need your uncle who did it 25 years ago. Not necessarily a family trait. It might be a family propensity. But you're still responsible for your own action. You're still responsible for God for your actions. Sometimes, I was poor, so I had to steal something because I'm poor and I didn't have what I needed, so I stole it. That's still a violation of a godly principle. Verse 13 says, friends, look at verse 13. Let no man say when he's tempted. Tempted to steal something at Walmart. Tempted to take too long a look at a lady. Whatever it is, when you're tempted, just don't fall into it. That's an exhortation that forbids anybody from blaming God. Verse 13 says, let nobody say when they're tempted, God did this to me. Don't let anybody say that. He's implying that somebody who really knows God has a meekness and a brokenness about his own ability to sin. If you're there, you'll never blame God for your mistakes and your sin. James has no place for this kind of foolishness. There's no place for excuses. Like the poor man, when he becomes a thief and he steals, he thinks he's justified because he's poor. He blames that circumstance for his stealing. It's like a drunk that goes out and wrecks their car and kills somebody in the process. He blames his family or his business driving him to drink. There are all these other excuses for why he had to imbibe. Or the pressure. And so when you do that, you have a tendency to feel like the pressure's off because you have an escape valve, or you have somebody to blame that takes you off the hot seat. But in God's eyes, it doesn't. In Matthew chapter 4, the Holy Spirit led Jesus out into the wilderness to be tested by Satan himself. So somebody says, well, didn't God, by the Spirit, lead him out for the temptation? No, he wasn't. He was led out to be tested. He was led out to be tested. And since he passed all the tests, none of them were really temptations, because a trial can start out as a trial, but if it goes on and it's not dealt with soon, it can become a temptation, because they never led to what? None of those, the three things. You got to think about that for just a minute. Jesus had been out fasting in the desert 40 days, 40 nights, and he was being taunted and tempted, chased around by the devil himself for 40 days and 40, just being prodded, just a little poke in the back. If you're a man, you really really hate getting hit in the back or the shoulder. That's like saying sick him to a sick dog. 40 days and 40 nights with nothing to eat, nothing to drink. And all the time, Satan's just kind of shoving you in the shoulder, trying to get you to sin. And after he figures you were just about as far as you could go, humanly speaking, he gives you three temptations, three tests. And Jesus passed every one of those tests. So therefore, they never turned to him. Satan tried to tempt him. Hey, you got to be hungry after 40 days. And if you're really God, why don't you take these stones and just turn them into bread? That way we both can have something to eat. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's what Jesus did every time. Every time. He quoted Scripture back to the devil. These were tests. He was proven to be the Son of God. And at the end of this, of the 40 days and the 40 nights, and the angels came and ministered to him. 1 Corinthians says there's no trial or temptation will overtake you that's not common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted. Tempted what? Above what you are able, but with the temptation will make an escape that you're going to be able to bear it. That's very important to remember, because God will, if you're tested and it turns into temptation, even in a temptation, there'll be a moment there where God's going to give you an escape path to get away from this temptation. It's up to us to find that escape path and get out of there before it wrecks our witness, wrecks our testimony. Lead us not into the power of some trial that's beyond us. In Matthew 6, I'm thinking about. So the truth of, it's the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6. So the truth of Jesus stands. God tempts no one. He allows temptation to go on. Men like David can make a choice. David made some excellent choices, but David also made a couple bad choices. But God doesn't tempt. He does allow us to test us. He's the one that tests us. Even as he allowed Christ to be tempted, but never more than he was able to bear, and always given a way out. Given a resource for victory if we choose that victory and claim it. But unfortunately, a lot of times we get so far in, we don't see we can't see the window for the door. And we fall into temptation. And we fall into sin. So the nature of evil says that God can't be tempted, but he can't even experience evil. So therefore, he can't tempt anybody else. God's delight is only in the pure and holy. The nature of man is not what evil is, but what man is. Look at verse 14. For every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. But, it's an important word, the first word that's important. But every man. So there's no escape clause. It doesn't say anything what kind of man. It just says, but every man is tempted. Every man is tempted. Temptation doesn't come from God. Every man, nobody's outside of this one. Nobody's above it. Nobody's below it. When everybody is tempted, present tense. Then he's dragged away and he's enticed. There's two interesting words here. And we need to mark both of those. when he's drugged away by his own lust, his own evil. The first word is from a hunting term. It's used of luring an animal into a trap. The trap is baited, so then the animals come and they fall into the trap. So what this first one in verse 14 means is he's drawn away into a trap. The trap is set. The trap falls. The second word is entice. Entice is a fishing term. This is a word that means to capture a fish with bait. To bait a hook and catch a fish. The problem is this: every person is tempted, the hook is baited, the trap is baited, and we're lured away, we're compelled away, and dragged away, and we're beguiled away. These terms see one being tempted as lured deceptively, then hooked or trapped in sin. And that's usually the way sin works. The reason animals are baited and trapped and fish are baited and trapped is because the bait looks good to them. You see the story that's coming here now? You're enticed away by something you see, something that goes on that sets the trap for you, and it's something more than you think you can bear, and you fall into it and you get caught. It looks attractive, it looks inviting, and all they see whenever you're being tempted like that is you see the bait. You don't see the trap that's going to catch you. You just see the bait that's inside the trap, and that's what you're going for, and that's what you try to catch. And especially if you're a mouse in a trap, it's fatal. A lot of times, some of these things that we fall into are fatal mistakes. Drugs. You can watch TV and you can see the glory of drugs, all these things, drug culture and all this other stuff that's going on. You never see the other side of it. They show alcohol being consumed, and there's beautiful people having wine, having this, having the other thing, and they're all just, yes, it's not the reality. Not the reality. You see people smoking cigarettes. Now, I'm not anti, I guess I am, sort of, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I guess what I'm saying is, have you ever gone to an alcohol rehab? I did when I was a baby counselor. I spent a long time working with drug and alcohol folks. They have every excuse in the book other than they did it, they enjoyed it, they liked it. You go and see folks that have been smoking when you're in the hospital, you're doing your counseling, you go by and you see ventilators going, you see people with oxygen, you see people that have holes in their throat to breathe through, all because of cigarettes. You hear people coughing from the bottom of their ankles all the way up. People with cancer, especially lung cancer. You see that. So you see the other side of what temptation looks like. You see broken homes because the temptation of another woman has gotten in the middle of a family and caused the family to bust up. That's the backside that TV and Hollywood never wants to show us. They just want to show us a false sense of the good life. That's really not so good. And sometimes it'll just dangle out there, the temptation will dangle, and it'll look good like a fishing lure does to a fish, and it looks good, and the fish bites it or swims around for a minute, and all of a sudden it just looks too cotton thick and good for the fish, and it grabs for the shiny object and gets caught on the hook and ends up on a plate. A lot of times Christians get hooked. They end up on Satan's plate, and he's wrecked a marriage, he's wrecked a home, he's wrecked a life. Don't fall into those kind of temptations. It's not God's fault. The problem is the devil, and that's a lot of times we just get ourselves into those kinds of trouble. We can get ourselves in deep trouble quickly. So world of wicked men and demons and the devil, Jesus had them all around him all of his life, but he never sinned. So that's a perfect example, because Jesus was never left alone from the demons and the devil. The temptation early in his career, life, the devil never left him. And he never sinned. There was no lust, there was no pull, nothing could could attract him in any way from his focus of what he came to do. You see, the problem is not the tempter without. The devil doesn't make you do it. The problem is not the tempter. The problem is the traitor that lives inside of us. When people understand that we get ourselves in our own messes, Satan will help, Satan will bait the trap, but we end up stepping on the trap or getting in the trap ourselves. We bring ourselves into that. The issue is the nature of man is a part of us. There's a part of us because we're humans and we've been raised in a culture where enough is never enough. We've been raised in a culture where if you get yourself a nice Chevrolet, well, then you need a small Cadillac. Then you get a small Cadillac, and then you need a Lincoln Continental. Then you get a Lincoln Continental, and I don't know what's above that, but you're never happy with what you got. You get a little 2-bedroom house, well, you got to have a 3-bedroom. Then you got to have a 4-bedroom. Then you got to have a basement. You're never happy. People just plain aren't happy. Status quo is never good enough for people today. Your income's enough to meet your basic needs and save a little bit, and you go through life. That's never enough. You got to have more. Always more. But we do that to ourselves, and that's the way Hollywood and TV commercials and all that, they try to get us to think that we can never be satisfied with the day as it is. We always have to have more. And that's the flesh. And the flesh will drive us towards baited hooks. So God's not responsible for the temptation of our sin. So in verse 15 we see a shift. When the lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. Yeah. Now we're going to childbirth. So we've gone from baiting and tracking. Now we're going to go to childbirth. So here a child is sin, and when it comes forth, it doesn't do anything but what? Sin produces death. Yeah. Sin produces death. If you're unsaved today, it can be eternal death, eternal separation from God the Father, Jesus the Son. Desire, number one thing, some D words, desire, something new. It's a feeling, desire, and that's what advertising are trying to do, is a desire in your heart, something you see in a car window, or something you see on a car lot. It's a car that you just have to have, and you open the door and it smells like a new car, and how good it is. Something you see, so it becomes a desire in your heart, and that becomes the focal part of your thinking because you're desiring whatever that is. Number two, deception. A lot of times in the mind we'll rationalize why we need that new car, why we need that bigger house, and then it'll draw us away, and then we feel like we have to have it. It's our right to have it because it looks good. So therefore, because it looks good, I need it. So therefore, I got to have it. And that will get us into design, the will. So it goes from the emotions to the mind. So now your will is forming a plan or design to get that. Number 4 is disobedience. Things that bring forth sin. House, car, we see it, we desire it, then we move to deception. In our mind, we need this car or this house. It looks, I look good driving this car. Yeah. I look good driving this. I look good with this address. I look good living in this house. Then design to come up with a plan to do it. Well, if I only eat twice a week, and I work 2 jobs, I can drive this car or I can live in my dream house. I'm going to eat twice a week and work 2 jobs. A fellow once said, we spend a lot of time buying things to impress people we don't like with money we don't have. A lot of truth to that. Yep. Number 4, disobedience. Disobedience. God tried to shut the door. The salesman ran our credit, said, no, this really doesn't fit in your price range. This house is a little more than you can afford the monthly payments on the car. So, in disobedience, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and get a cosigner. I'll go out and get 2 or 3 cosigners to underwrite what I want because I need it. And then we'll come up with all the money. And a friend said God might be saying no to this. I imagine God is. If you got to have cosigners and all the rest of it, God is trying to get your attention. And that's why it's so hard, but it doesn't. That is God saying, get away from this temptation. The scripture says, God will give me the desires of my heart, but he'll never say, I got to have a close that. He's never going to say that this woman's better than my wife. He's never going to say this, I need this house because it's... He's never going to say, I need this car, and the car I have is perfectly fine. That's ourselves. So nobody can say, when they're tempted, that God threw me this temptation and I succumbed to it. Because we saw in our text today that God doesn't tempt you. God will never tempt you. God won't tempt you to sin. Father, we thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you that you don't tempt us. You test us, you try us, but that's an issue of our faith. Temptation takes it way beyond that. Lord, we do love you. We want to serve you. And we thank you for your grace and your mercy.